She cried out through the iron that cut her wrists raw. Mama said you'd save me. He had not heard his own name spoken in years. Gideon, not the name the mountain had given him, the name whispered in the valley like a ghost story, his real name. Yet when the mountain man turned, he found a child, chained and trembling, her eyes wide with a desperate, impossible faith. His arms opened before his heart even knew why. The chains rattled like angry snakes in the dusk. That harsh clinking was louder than the whip of wind that stirred the pines. Gideon Holt, a man who had chosen silence and solitude high in these ridges, froze as the tiny voice tore right through him. He had only come down into the valley for salt and a sack of flour. A simple trip, but here, where the trail cut close to the abandoned mining shacks, he found her. A girl no older than 7. Her dress was torn, her cheeks hollowed, her lips split from thirst. Her small arms trembled as she lifted them toward him, the shackles impossibly heavy on her thin frame. Gideon had faced storms that tore cabins from their posts. He'd faced wolves that hunted men as if they were deer. But nothing in all his years struck him harder than the sight of this child, clinging to hope as if it were breath itself. His first step cracked the silence, his boots grinding against the frozen dirt. The girl flinched, shrinking back against the splintered beam that held her captive. But even as fear flickered in her eyes, her words trembled out again, like she was reciting a promise handed down from lips she trusted more than her own heartbeat. Mama said you'd save me. She said you would come. Her voice broke on the last word, so soft and hoarse that Gideon nearly thought it was the whisper of wind. But this was no ghost. This was a child carved from suffering, left where no one would dare to look. Gideon knelt slowly, lowering his massive frame to her eye level. His hands, steady enough to build a cabin or aim a rifle, trembled. He saw it then. Bruises in shapes no child should ever carry. The chain bit into her ankles, rubbing her skin raw. Yet she clutched a torn scrap of fabric to her chest, a bit of faded calico, worn soft, clearly once part of a woman's dress. Her thumb rubbed it again and again, the way a soul rubs a prayer bead. Mama said, she repeated, her eyes shining through the dirt and tears, you'd come. A storm rolled in Gideon's chest. For years he had buried himself in this high country to escape the ruin of his own family, to drown the memory of 2 small graves he could never unsee. He had sworn an oath to himself, to the mountain, to God. Never again. Never take on another soul. Never open the door of his heart again. But the sight of her, that raw faith, the chains, the whisper of a mother who had clearly given her last breath, promising deliverance, it undid him. His arms reached before his will. His hands, calloused and strong, closed around the iron links. A growl was born in his chest, not of anger, but of a silence finally breaking. He pulled. Rust screamed. The chain strained. Still he pulled, his muscles burning, until the wooden beam cracked, until the iron itself bent under the strain. The girl sobbed out loud, a raw, broken sound. Her knees gave way as freedom pulled her forward. Gideon caught her against his chest before she could hit the ground. She fit there as if she had always belonged, small and trembling, clutching that torn scrap of fabric to her cheek. He held her, and though his eyes had not known tears in decades, they burned hot and heavy now, spilling down his weathered face as the weight of it all pressed down. In that moment, Gideon Holt, the man the mountains had claimed, wept openly for the first time since burying his wife and son. But even as his heart broke open, the world reminded him that mercy never came cheap. A sharp snap echoed from the ridge above, the distinct sound of a rifle's safety being pulled back. Gideon turned in a flash, his body instinctively sheltering the girl. Shadows shifted among the rocks. The chain had not been left by accident. This child had not been abandoned here by fate alone. This was bait, a cruel snare laid not for beasts, but for men. And he had just walked right into it. The girl's small hands clung tighter to his coat. Don't let them take me back, she begged, her voice no louder than breath against his collar. Her plea cut deeper than the iron ever could. Gideon's jaw clenched so hard it ached. He could feel unseen eyes trained on his every move, waiting, watching, ready to strike. He adjusted his stance, wide and steady, shielding her with his frame. Whatever lay ahead, he would not step back. He had been given a charge, a mission far holier than his own life. It was the promise of a mother's last words carried in a child's unshakable faith. The wind grew sharp. A horse snorted above them on the ridge. Then a voice, smooth and cruel, rolled down the slope like thunder from a clear sky. "Step away from the girl, mountain man. She don't belong to you." That voice carried a confidence that had nothing to do with righteousness and everything to do with power long abused. Gideon's back stiffened. He tightened his hold on the girl, feeling her small frame tremble against his chest. But she made no sound now. No cry, no whimper. Only a dead silence, as if she knew that sound itself could call down even more cruelty. Gideon slowly turned his body, keeping her pressed into the shelter of his arms while his eyes scanned the ridge. And there they were, 3 riders, their horses restless in the failing light, steam curling from flared nostrils. These weren't drifters or miners. They were men who lived on the back of fear. Long coats, polished boots caked in dust, and rifles too fine for the hills they prowled. The one in the center dismounted with a deliberate, easy grace, his boots crunching into the gravel. His hat was broad-brimmed, shadowing a face that carried a smirk too practiced to be real. His voice slithered down again. "That girl belongs to us." He spoke the word belongs as if it was natural, as if she were no more than a lost saddlebag left lying on the trail. Gideon felt the child's fingers tighten into the fabric of his coat, digging deep as though she feared being ripped from him that very instant. He angled his stance, placing one foot back, weight balanced, ready for anything. "You'll not take her," Gideon said. His voice was gravel itself, low and firm. Years of silence had turned it into a wall of unshakable steel. The man tilted his head, amused. "Mountain folk always think they can fight the tide, but tides don't listen, Holt." The sound of his name made Gideon's muscles coil tight. Holt. They knew his name. Not just any name, but the one he'd used to disappear. Whoever these men were, they had done their homework. This was no random encounter. He had buried his past high in these ridges, and yet somehow it had been dug up and dragged back into the light. He forced the thought aside. One thing at a time. Protect the child. The man gestured casually, a flick of his fingers. One of the other riders shifted his rifle across his saddle, the barrel catching the last dim light. The message was clear. One wrong move, and the girl would pay the price. Gideon crouched slightly, lowering his face close to the girl's ear. "Close your eyes," he whispered. She obeyed instantly, pressing her forehead into his chest, clutching that calico scrap with all her might. "Who was her mother?" Gideon asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The man's smirk faltered, just for a second. His gaze flicked to the girl, then back to Gideon. A shadow of annoyance crossed his features, like a poker player forced to show his hand too early. He recovered quickly. "Doesn't matter," he said coldly. "She's ours now." But Gideon saw something else in that flicker. Recognition. He pushed harder. "I asked you a name." The man's face tightened. "The woman is dead. The girl is property. That's all you need to know." Gideon's breath hissed between his teeth. He had heard enough. In that one sentence lay all he needed to know about these men. This was no matter of law or family. This was a theft of flesh and blood, a crime carved into the child's very bones. These were men who profited from chains, who saw no difference between cattle and a 7-year-old girl with eyes too old for her years. He shifted the girl higher against his chest, feeling her ribs, far too sharp through the thin dress. His voice rumbled, steady and final. "She's not yours. She never was." The smirk disappeared completely now, replaced by a cold, ugly sneer. "Then you've just bought yourself a grave, Holt?" The man snapped his fingers. On the ridge, the 2 riders pulled their rifles to their shoulders in perfect, chilling unison. The crack of iron sliding into place echoed like thunderclaps in the quiet valley. Gideon didn't wait. He twisted his frame, crouched low, and rolled toward the nearest outcrop of rock, shielding the girl with his own body as a shot exploded behind him. The blast tore splinters from the beam where she had been chained only moments before. Her scream was muffled against his chest, but her arms clung tighter, trusting, desperate. They would not get her. not while he drew breath. Gideon reached the cover of the stone and pressed the child down gently, keeping his arm locked around her as bullets sparked off the rocks above their heads. His old Winchester was slung across his back, a weapon he had not fired in anger for years, not since the blood-soaked day that had driven him into exile, but his hands remembered. He swung it forward, the worn stock pressing familiar and solid against his shoulder. He drew in a breath, slow and deep, steadying himself against the pounding in his chest. The child tugged at his sleeve. Her voice was trembling but somehow strong. "Mama said you'd save me," she whispered again. Not as a plea, but as a statement of fact. Gideon looked into her eyes. They were blue, rimmed with red from tears, yet shining with something utterly unbroken. It cut him deeper than the wind could ever cut. "I will," he promised, his voice rough but sure. "I will." Another shot slammed into the rock, spraying stone chips into the air. Gideon angled his rifle, peering past the edge of the boulder. The riders were bold but sloppy, too confident in their numbers. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of his Winchester echoed through the valley. One horse reared as its rider was thrown backward into the dust. The other men shouted, their perfect formation breaking in surprise. The girl flinched at the sound, but Gideon's arm was there, steadying her, shielding her ears as best he could. The leader snarled, his voice twisting with rage. "You'll regret that, Holt. You don't know who you're crossing." But Gideon did know. He knew enough. Men like this had been crawling across the frontier for too long, building their power on backs too small to resist. He shifted his position. Another shot tore from his rifle, forcing the second rider to duck back behind cover. But his victory was brief. Hoofbeats thundered from farther down the ridge. More riders, the sound rolling toward them like an oncoming storm. The girl whimpered, clutching tighter. Gideon gritted his teeth. They had laid this trap well. He had only moments before the noose tightened for good. His eyes darted to the line of pines edging the trail. If he could make it to the cover of the trees with a child in his arms, they might just vanish into the mountain's endless folds. It was a slim chance, but it was all he had. Gideon slung the rifle back across his shoulder, scooped the girl against him, and with a deep breath, he broke from cover. Bullets hissed past, spitting snow and dirt into the air. His boots pounded against the hard earth. Each step was a promise carved into the frozen ground. She would not go back into chains. Not ever. The girl buried her face in his chest, her small hands clinging with all the strength left in her. He could feel her heartbeat racing against his ribs, frantic but alive. He ran harder. The forest loomed ahead, dark and thick. If they could just make it. But the thunder of hooves drew nearer. The leader's voice rang out, sharp and venomous. "Bring him down! Don't let him reach the trees!" The girl's sob escaped, raw and broken. "Don't let them take me, please." And Gideon Holt, mountain man, exile, a man who thought his heart was long dead, surged forward with a fury he thought he'd buried years ago. For the first time in a very long time, his life had a purpose again, and he would not surrender it to the darkness that stalked them. The trees opened like a waiting mouth, their shadows ready to swallow them whole, just as another volley of shots rang out from behind. The hunt had only just begun. The forest closed around them like a fortress of shadows, swallowing the echoes of gunfire into its dense, silent belly. The pines rose tall and unyielding, their boughs heavy with snow, their trunks pressed so tight that no rider could charge straight through without weaving. Gideon's breath steamed in ragged bursts as he barreled deeper, his boots crunching over roots and ice. The child clutched his chest, a silent, precious weight. Her eyes were wide, darting through the gloom, but she didn't cry now. Maybe she knew silence was her best shield. Or maybe she had simply cried all the tears her young body could spare. Her small heart thudded against his ribs like a sparrow trapped in a cage. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew muddled. Horses were struggling to weave between the trees. Men were shouting curses to one another. A branch snapped under misplaced weight. They were hunters, but the mountains have a way of turning hunters into prey. Gideon had lived among these ridges long enough to know their language. Every hollow, every frozen creek, every game trail was etched into him as surely as the scars on his skin. The men behind him might have numbers, but they were strangers here, and strangers bled fast in Gideon's world. He slowed only when they had cleared the first stretch of dense timber, the shouts growing faint behind them. Kneeling low behind a thick, fallen log, he pressed the child gently into the hollow between the trunk and the snow, cupping her face with his rough, frost-bitten hands. "Stay low," he whispered. "Don't move till I come for you." Her lip trembled, but she nodded, her fingers still wrapped tight around that scrap of calico. Her faith, that fragile and impossible faith, clung to him more tightly than her small hands ever could. Gideon rose again, slipping his Winchester free and pressing his back to a pine. He drew a slow breath, steadying his pulse. Memories clawed at him, of nights long ago when he had sworn never again to point a rifle at another man. Nights when the earth had opened up to swallow the ones he loved, and the weapon in his hand had done nothing to stop it. But tonight, the barrel was not for vengeance. It was for her, for a child whose mother had spoken a prophecy with her dying breath, for chains broken by his own two hands. The first rider broke through the trees ahead, a dark shape thrashing its way between branches. Gideon lifted his rifle, sighting down the barrel with a calm, cold precision. He didn't fire immediately. He waited. He let the horse stumble over a root, let the rider lean just enough to expose his shoulder. Then Gideon squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the forest like a whip. The man tumbled from the saddle, his cry muffled by the snow. The horse bolted, crashing through the brush and vanishing into the dark. The shouts behind them grew louder, closer. "He's in the trees! Flush him out!" Another shot split the air. This one was close enough that bark sprayed Gideon's cheek. He ducked lower, then moved, circling wide. His boots barely whispered over the snow. Each step was measured, deliberate. These men were loud, careless. They expected him to run in a straight line like frightened prey. But Gideon was not prey. He was the ridge itself. He was the storm that broke men who thought they owned the world. Two more riders pushed in from the flank. Gideon slipped behind another massive trunk, his heart steady, then pivoted out just long enough to fire once, twice. One horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider hard against a tree. The other rider ducked back, his curses echoing as they were muffled by the trees. Gideon didn't linger to admire his work. He pressed onward, back toward the log where the girl lay hidden. He could not let the distance stretch too far between them. Not now, not ever. When he returned, she was still there, knees drawn to her chest, eyes searching the dark. Relief washed across her face when she saw him, as though the very sight of him had proven her mother's words true once more. He bent, scooped her up, and pressed her against him. "Hold on," he murmured. She wrapped her arms around his neck and did not let go. He moved again, deeper into the woods, following trails invisible to most eyes. A narrow draw wound its way uphill, hemmed in by stone and tangled brush, a path Gideon knew would lead to a ridge overlooked by no man save those born to it. The climb was brutal. Snow dragged at his boots, and the girl's weight was a living reminder of his vow. But he pressed on, every muscle alive with a stubborn, protective fire. Behind them the voices grew faint, scattered by the trees and the rising wind. Still, the chase was not over. These men were too organized, too determined to quit at the first loss. Halfway up the climb, the girl finally spoke again, her voice a fragile thread in the cold. "They took Mama," she whispered, each word heavy with a memory he could only imagine. "She told me not to cry. She said you would come." Gideon's throat tightened, but he did not falter in his steps. He glanced down at her, strands of her tangled hair pressed against his worn coat. "What's your name?" he asked gently, needing to give a name to the soul he now carried. Her lips parted, her eyes glimmering in the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy. "Clara," she whispered. "My name is Clara." The name sank deep into Gideon's heart, carving itself there, as if it had always belonged. He whispered it back, more a vow than a word. "Clara." She closed her eyes, resting her head against him, as though the sound of her own name spoken with such care was a balm strong enough to ease her fear. The ridge finally leveled out, opening onto a shelf of rock that overlooked the entire valley below. And what Gideon saw from there made his blood run cold. Down below, faint glows of campfires were spreading like a sickness across the land. More men than he had hoped for. A whole band, spread wide and organized. Whoever had taken Clara, it wasn't just a ragtag bunch of drifters. This was something darker, deeper. Men who traded in flesh, who had laid snares not just for one child, but for any unfortunate soul who crossed these paths. Clara stirred against his shoulder, her voice trembling. "They'll come again." "Yes," Gideon answered simply, his gaze never leaving the fires below. "But they'll not take you, not while I stand." The wind sharpened, carrying the faint clang of metal from the valley, a hammer striking an anvil, perhaps, or the sound of chains rattling in cruel hands. Gideon's jaw tightened. This fight was larger than he had thought, larger than one child, one rescue. Yet the girl in his arms was no accident. She was a charge, a gift laid upon him by Providence itself. And if her mother's dying breath had spoken the truth, then perhaps Gideon Holt had been called out of his self-imposed grave for this very night. He crouched beside a stone outcrop, pulling a worn blanket from his pack to wrap Clara against the biting cold. "Rest," he told her softly. "I'll keep watch." She curled into the rough fabric, her thumb pressing the calico scrap to her cheek, her eyes fluttering shut in weary surrender. For a moment, as her breathing slowed and deepened, Gideon's chest loosened. She was safe for now. But in the valley below, the firelight spread wider. More voices were rising on the wind. More hoofbeats were gathering. A storm of men was building, just waiting for the dawn. Gideon knew the hours ahead would decide everything. Whether Clara remained free, or whether the chains would close around her again. And as the first faint gray light of morning touched the highest ridges, Gideon whispered into the wind, half prayer, half vow. "Lord, give me the strength." The trees groaned in the cold, and far below a horn sounded, sharp and commanding. The hunt was gathering again. The horn's call carried through the valleys like the wail of some restless spirit, sharp enough to rattle the birds from their roosts and send Clara's small body stiffening inside the blanket. Her eyes snapped open, fear surging anew, but Gideon's hand was already on her shoulder, steady and warm. He met her gaze with calm steel. "Don't be afraid," he murmured, though he could hear his own heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. "They'll not take you while I breathe." Clara clung to his arm, her thin fingers trembling as she whispered, "They're coming, aren't they?" "Yes," Gideon said simply. He wouldn't lie to her. He never had much use for lies, especially not with children whose worlds were already too full of broken promises. "But we'll be ready." He rose, slinging his rifle across his back, and turned his eyes to the fires below. The camp had grown. It stretched wider than he had guessed in the dark. Shapes moved about with a grim purpose. Men leading horses, men dragging iron pots from the flames, men checking rifles and pistols with practiced efficiency. He counted at least 20, maybe more. This was no passing gang of outlaws. This was an operation, a trade fueled by cruelty. He saw now what Clara had been meant for, and his gut burned with a cold, hard fury. The faint clatter of chains rose on the morning air again, unmistakable above the crackling of fire. There were others down there, souls locked away, nameless and waiting to be sold like cattle. Clara stirred at his side, her voice cracking as she whispered, "Mama said you'd save me. But what about them?" She lifted one frail, dirt-stained hand toward the distant glow of the camp. "There's more." Gideon's chest tightened until it ached. He had thought himself done with the world, finished with its burdens and its endless cruelties. He had buried his wife and son in the shallow mountain earth, then buried his heart right beside them, vowing never again to risk it. Yet here he stood, a little girl at his side, reminding him that no vow of solitude could erase what God had carved into his soul, the spirit of a protector. Clara's question cut deeper than any chain. If he walked away with only her, leaving the others to the fate she had so narrowly escaped, what kind of salvation was that? But he did not speak his thoughts. Not yet. Instead, he reached down and tucked the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "One thing at a time," he said softly. "First, we get you safe." Her lips trembled, but she nodded, trusting him still. And it was that trust that weighed heavier than any iron. The ridge grew colder as dawn began to creep over the peaks, streaking the sky with a bruised purple light. Gideon knew they couldn't remain where they were. The hunters would scour the timber come sunrise, sweeping every draw and hollow until no stone was left unturned. He had to move Clara higher, deeper into the mountains, where the cliffs grew jagged and the paths so narrow they would favor a man on foot over riders on horseback. He crouched low, lifting her gently back into his arms. Her head pressed against his chest, and though she trembled, she did not resist. The climb was merciless. The rocks were slick with frost, the air thin and biting. Gideon's muscles screamed with each upward step, his breath coming in ragged bursts. But he did not falter. Clara's weight was feather light, yet it carried the heaviness of an oath he could not, would not, break. With every ledge he scaled, every frozen branch he pushed aside, he whispered a prayer under his breath, not for himself, but for her, for the strength to carry her farther, higher, safer. At last they reached a cleft in the ridge, a narrow cave half hidden behind a tumble of ancient stone. Gideon ducked inside, setting Clara gently upon the dry ground. The space was small, just enough for shelter, the air smelling faintly of pine and damp earth. Clara shivered, her eyes darting to the mouth of the cave. "Will they find us here?" "Not if we're careful," Gideon replied. He laid a hand on her shoulder, firm and reassuring. "Rest a while. I'll keep watch." But Clara did not rest. Not yet. She sat there with her knees pulled to her chest, the scrap of calico clutched tight. Her eyes glistened in the dim light, and her small voice broke the silence. "Mama said, if I was scared, I should pray. She said prayers are stronger when someone listens. Will you listen?" The word struck Gideon like a hammer. Listen. It had been years since he had prayed aloud, years since he had dared to believe that heaven even heard the cries of broken men. But looking into Clara's eyes, he knew this wasn't about him. This was about her, about giving her something to hold on to when everything else had been stripped away. He knelt beside her, his large, rough hand covering hers. "Go on," he said gently. "I'm listening." Her eyes fluttered close, her lips trembling as she whispered halting, simple words. "God, please don't let them take me back. Please keep Mama safe in heaven. And please, please help Mr. Gideon be strong." A single tear slipped down her cheek, shining faintly in the gray light of the cave. Gideon's throat ached, but he bowed his head beside hers, his own eyes closing too. For the first time in years, he let the silence of prayer wash over him. Not his own words, but the pure, unbroken faith of a child. When she finished, she looked up at him, as though waiting for something more. Gideon swallowed hard and whispered the only word that felt right. "Amen." The girl smiled faintly, a fragile, beautiful thing. Her small shoulders relaxed for the first time since he had found her. That tiny smile filled the dark cave with more light than the dawn itself. But the peace did not last long. From outside came the crunch of hooves on snow, faint but growing nearer. Gideon's head snapped up, every muscle taut. Clara's eyes widened, and she pressed herself deeper into the blanket. Gideon motioned for silence, creeping to the cave's mouth. He flattened himself against the cold rock, peering through a narrow slit between the boulders. 3 riders were moving along the ridge below, their rifles slung, but their eyes sharp, scanning the slopes. They were methodical, searching every hollow, every shadow. Gideon's jaw tightened. If they climbed higher, they would stumble across the cave. And if they did, there would be no escape without bloodshed right here, right in front of her. He turned back to Clara, his voice a low whisper. "Stay here, don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, don't come out." Her lip trembled, but she nodded, clutching the calico tight. Gideon slipped from the cave, moving low and silent across the rocks. He circled wide, climbing above the riders until he stood on a ledge overlooking them. He steadied his rifle, his breath slow and even. The men rode closer, their leader raising a hand to signal a stop. They were skilled, more disciplined than the fools he'd scattered last night. He couldn't just scare them off. The first man dismounted, crouching to study the snow. His eyes narrowed, and he called something to the others. Gideon knew then, They had seen enough to know he was near. He tightened his grip on the Winchester, ready to fire, when Clara's voice suddenly echoed in his mind. Prayers are stronger when someone listens. He shut his eyes for the briefest moment, a whisper on his lips. Lord, let me protect her. Then he squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack split the cold mountain air. The dismounted man crumpled, his shout cut short. The horses screamed, rearing back as the other two riders dove for cover. Gunfire answered instantly, bullets sparking off the stone near Gideon's perch. He shifted, firing again, forcing them lower. They cursed and scattered, sliding behind boulders. But as he watched them, Gideon's heart sank as he realized the truth. He hadn't stopped them. He had only confirmed his position. More would come now. This was only the edge of the net tightening around them. He retreated quickly, slipping back toward the cave. Clara's wide, terrified eyes met him as he ducked inside. She flung her arms around him, burying her face into his coat. He held her close, his voice steady despite the furious pounding in his chest. We have to move. Outside, voices were shouting, more men closing in from below. Gideon swept Clara up, slinging the rifle back over his shoulder. The mountains wouldn't hide them much longer. The hunters were driving them, tightening the noose, and the only path left was forward, straight into the teeth of the storm gathering in the valley below. As Gideon stepped from the cave, carrying Clara out into the bitter dawn, the wind shifted. It carried the sound of drums. Or maybe it was just the pounding of dozens of hooves on the frozen earth. Either way, war was coming, and there would be no turning back. The morning broke with a harsh gray light that was unforgiving, painting the ridges in tones of steel. Gideon carried Clara close, his boots crunching over rock and ice as he moved with a grim purpose. The hunters were closing in, their voices echoing, faint and cruel in the valleys below. But the mountain man did not falter. Each step carried more weight than just the child in his arms. It carried a vow, a prayer, and a reckoning that was long overdue. The trail narrowed as he climbed even higher, the slope now jagged with boulders and splintered trees scarred by old lightning strikes. Clara's small fingers clutched at his coat, her breath shallow against his chest. She had stopped asking if they were safe. Even at her tender age, she knew the truth. Safety was no longer something given. It had to be fought for. By mid-morning, Gideon reached a plateau, a high ledge where the mountain opened onto a vast, staggering view of the world below. And from here, he could see them all. Dozens of riders moving with grim discipline, sweeping through the forest like wolves hunting a wounded stag. The campfires from the night before had dwindled, but their smoke still lingered, a dark stain against the pale sky. And worse, much worse, he could now clearly see the shapes of others, chained together at the heart of that camp. Men, women, children, their heads bowed, their movements sluggish and defeated. Slaves. Gideon's stomach turned with a fury so hot it felt like poison. Clara was not alone. Her mother had died trying to spare her this fate, but countless others had been abandoned to it. Clara stirred, following his gaze. They'll take them too, she whispered, her voice so small it was nearly lost to the wind. Gideon's jaw clenched as he pulled her closer. He wanted to tell her no, wanted to offer her the comfort of a false certainty, but he would not lie. Not to her. Not when her eyes already held too much sorrow. They will not, he said instead, his voice like stone. Not if I have any strength left in me. For hours he moved, weaving higher and higher into the peaks, searching for a path, for a place to hide Clara where the hunters could not possibly reach. But the mountains offered little mercy. Every draw seemed to funnel back down toward the valley. Every pass cut too near the sprawling camp below. The hunters had chosen their ground well. Gideon was being herded, whether he wanted to admit it or not. At last he found a small break in the cliffs, a shallow hollow beneath a rocky overhang where ancient pine roots jutted from the stone like grasping fingers. He eased Clara down, wrapping her in the blanket again. Her eyes were heavy, exhaustion dragging at her small frame, but she fought sleep with a stubborn will. Don't leave me, she whispered, her hand clutching his sleeve. I won't, Gideon said firmly. But as he looked into her exhausted eyes, he knew a terrible truth. He could not win this battle alone. He needed help. But who in these god-forsaken ridges would dare to stand against such men? Most folks would turn away, too afraid, too beaten down by the weight of a power that seemed utterly unstoppable. Gideon's mind turned to a name he had not spoken in years: Abraham Cutter. Once, long ago, Abraham had been Gideon's closest friend, a man of deep faith and solid iron, who had fought beside him when the frontier was still raw and lawless. But tragedy had torn them apart, each man retreating into his own impenetrable fortress of grief. Gideon had not seen him in nearly a decade. Still, if Abraham lived, if he still breathed this mountain air, he was the only man Gideon could trust with such a burden. He crouched, brushing Clara's tangled hair from her face. "I need you to be strong," he said quietly. "Strong enough to stay hidden for just a little while." Her eyes widened in alarm. "You're leaving me." "Not leaving," he corrected gently. "Just finding help. I will come back for you, Clara. On my life I will. Do you believe me?" She studied his face, her lip trembling, then gave a slow, solemn nod. "Mama said you'd save me," she whispered again, that refrain of faith that was now the core of his entire world. Gideon's throat tightened. He pressed his hand to hers, firm and steady. "And I will. But saving you for good means making sure they can never, ever take you again. And that's a fight I can't win alone." Reluctantly, she released his sleeve. Gideon tucked her deeper beneath the overhang, layering dead pine branches around her hiding place until she was nearly invisible. He showed her how to stay quiet, how to press herself into the shadows if she heard anyone coming. Then, with a final glance that seared her small, trusting image into his heart, he turned and slipped into the timber. The journey was long and perilous. Every mile was shadowed by the hunters sweeping ever closer through the trees below. Gideon moved like smoke, silent and swift, his deep knowledge of the ridges guiding him past their patrols. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, bleeding crimson across the snow-covered peaks. At last he reached it. A small cabin half buried in snow, with a faint curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. The sight stirred something old and deep in his chest. He knocked once, hard. The door creaked open, and there he stood. Abraham Cutter. He was still broad-shouldered, though gray now streaked his thick beard. His eyes widened when they fell on Gideon, surprise and something deeper, something like pain, flashing across his weathered face. "Gideon Holt," he muttered, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "I thought you were a ghost." "Not yet," Gideon said grimly, "but I've brought a storm to your door, Abram." Abraham's eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows behind him. "Get in," he said quickly, ushering him inside. The cabin was warm, plain, but meticulously cared for. Tools hung neatly on the walls, and a Bible sat open on the table, its pages worn from years of use. Abraham's gaze returned to Gideon, sharp and questioning. "Tell me." So Gideon did. He told him everything. He told him of Clara, of the chains, of the men who hunted them, of the sprawling camp below, where others languished in iron. Abraham listened in absolute silence, his jaw tightening, his knuckles whitening on the edge of the table. When Gideon finished, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the fire. At last Abraham spoke, his voice low but firm as the mountain itself. "You know what this means, don't you, Gideon? Taking her was only the first step. If we stand against them, there will be no turning back. Not until it's finished." "I know," Gideon said, his eyes meeting Abraham's across the flickering firelight. "But I can't turn away. Not from her. Not from the others." Abraham studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, a final resolute movement. "Then you're not alone." He rose, crossing the room to lift a heavy rifle from its place on the wall. His hands moved with a practiced, familiar ease, checking the chamber. "The Lord put her in your path for a reason, Gideon, and maybe he's giving us both one last chance to stand for something that matters." For the first time in years, Gideon felt the crushing weight of his solitude begin to shift. He was not alone, but even as a flicker of hope ignited in the small cabin, a sound from outside shattered it. The crunch of snow under heavy boots. Voices, low and harsh. Abraham stiffened, his rifle already in his hand. Gideon's jaw clenched. The hunters had found them, faster than he could have feared. Clara was still hidden in the hollow, alone and terrified. But now the fight had come to Abraham's door. The handle rattled once. Then a voice sneered from the darkness. "We know you're in there, Holt. Hand over the girl, and maybe we'll let you crawl out of here alive." Gideon lifted his own rifle, his voice as steady and cold as steel. "You'll never touch her again." The silence stretched for a single heartbeat. Then the door shuddered under a heavy, brutal kick. The storm had arrived. The first crash against the door rattled the cabin walls, sending dust motes dancing in the lantern light. Abraham Cutter's eyes locked with Gideon's, a silent, grim understanding passing between them. There was no time for hesitation. Gideon moved to one side of the door, his rifle steady, while Abraham took the other, his jaw set like granite, his hand white-knuckled around his own weapon. A second crash splintered the thick wood, followed by a guttural curse from outside. These men weren't trying to be subtle. They wanted Gideon to know they were coming, to let him taste fear before the end. But Gideon's heart wasn't filled with fear. It was filled with a burning fire, with a silent prayer, with the image of Clara hidden high on the mountain, clutching her mother's calico scrap. He could not fall here. He would not. The third crash burst the latch free. The door slammed open, banging hard against the interior wall. A dark figure lunged through the opening, rifle raised, but Gideon's shot cracked like thunder before the man could even clear the threshold. He was thrown backward into the snow, his weapon clattering uselessly from his grasp. Shouts erupted from the darkness. Boots crunched outside as more men pressed forward into the light. Abraham fired next, his shot tearing through the night, the muzzle flash illuminating his grim, determined face for a split second. Bullets split the air, slamming into the cabin's log frame, punching holes through the wood. Gideon ducked, dragging the heavy oak table onto its side and using it as cover. Abraham joined him. The two men crouched shoulder to shoulder as the storm of iron raged around them. The small cabin filled with smoke, the sharp tang of gunpowder, and the sting of flying wood splinters. Still, they returned fire, each shot measured, deliberate. Men screamed outside. Horses shrieked in panic. But more voices kept rising, shouting orders. There were too many. "They'll burn us out if we stay pinned down," Abraham growled, ramming another cartridge into his rifle. Gideon's eyes swept the cabin. The rear wall had a window. It was narrow and half frozen with frost. But it was an escape, a risky one. He glanced at Abraham. "We break through, circle them wide, lead them away from the ridge." Abraham's eyes narrowed. "And the girl?" "She's hidden," Gideon said firmly, though his heart clenched at the thought of Clara trembling, alone in the cold dark. "I'll draw them off. You keep them busy here." Abraham's expression tightened, but he gave a single sharp nod. "Don't you die out there, Holt. Not with her depending on you." Another volley of bullets ripped through the cabin, one grazing the edge of the table and spitting wood chips across Gideon's cheek. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reloaded, fired two sharp covering shots through the open door, then bolted for the back of the cabin. Abraham covered him, his own rifle booming in a steady, deafening rhythm. Gideon smashed the butt of his Winchester against the window frame, shattering the frost and glass. He scrambled through the opening and into the biting night air. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he landed, crouching low against the cabin wall. The shouts shifted instantly. "He's out back! Get him!" Boots thundered as men broke their formation to give chase. Gideon darted into the timber, his dark form vanishing into the deeper shadows. Bullets tore into the trees around him, sparks lighting the dark, but he moved like smoke. Silent, quick, relentless. The forest was in his blood, in his bones, and he knew how to use it. He weaved between the massive trunks, doubled back across his own tracks, using the ridges and hollows to confuse and splinter his pursuit. Behind him, the hunters cursed, their torchlight bobbing like angry, frustrated fireflies in the darkness. Still, he could not relax. He could hear them fanning out, methodical, tightening the noose. He had drawn them away from Abraham's door, but in doing so, he had pulled the storm closer to Clara. His heart pounded harder with every step, every instinct screaming at him to get back to her. He pushed himself faster, his lungs burning, his legs aching, until at last he crested the final ridge above her hiding place. The hollow lay quiet below him. Too quiet. Clara, Gideon hissed, dropping to his knees and shoving aside the pine branches he had so carefully laid across the overhang. His stomach turned to ice when his hands met nothing but cold, empty snow. The blanket was gone. The space was empty. For a single, horrifying heartbeat, the world stopped. His chest constricted, every breath failing him. Then he saw it. Prints in the snow. Small, desperate prints, dragged alongside the larger boot prints of men. The trail was fresh, and it led down toward the valley. A roar split the silence of the mountain, a low, broken sound torn from the deepest part of his soul. Clara was gone. They had her. He slammed his fist into the frozen earth, the sharp sting of pain jolting him back into focus. Rage surged through him, not blind, but sharpened like a razor's edge. He rose to his feet, following the tracks with a deadly cold precision. The snow told the story clearly. Men had found her, dragged her from the hollow, and were carrying her down toward the main camp. Clara's smaller prints were smeared and uneven, her struggle marked in every heartbreaking line. The hunt had shifted. No longer was Gideon fleeing. Now he was the one pursuing. He descended the ridge with a ferocity that made the mountain itself seem to tremble. His eyes locked on the campfires glowing brighter in the valley below, on the faint, terrible echo of chains rattling on the wind. Every step became a vow. Every breath became a prayer for strength. Every single heartbeat became a promise to Clara, and to the woman who had spoken his name with her dying breath. "Mama said you'd save me." When he neared the valley floor, the sounds from the camp sharpened. Laughter, harsh and mocking, drifted through the trees. Gideon crept low, crawling on his belly to the edge of the brush. The camp stretched wide, lit by half a dozen roaring fires, and Clara was there. He saw her instantly. She was bound again, this time to a thick post near the center of the camp. Her small form was huddled against it, her head bowed. A brute of a man stood guard beside her, swigging from a bottle, while other men lounged near the fire, tossing dice and gnawing on roasted meat. But it was what Gideon saw in the far corner of the camp that truly broke him. There, penned by iron bars like animals, were at least a dozen others. Women and children, their faces pale and gaunt in the firelight, their eyes vacant with despair. The fury inside him swelled until it nearly consumed him. Clara's words echoed in his mind. What about them? He could not just take her and leave the others behind. The chains had to break for all of them, yet he was only one man. Even with Abraham, if he was still alive, the odds were impossible. Still, Gideon knew there was no turning back. Providence had led him here. This battle was not his alone to bear. He withdrew into the shadows, his mind working fast. Abraham would try to regroup with him soon, if he had survived the cabin siege. If not, then Gideon would fight this war alone. Either way, Clara would not spend another minute in chains. Not tonight. As he crouched there, the wind shifted, carrying Clara's voice, faint but clear, across the distance. She was crying, her voice breaking with exhaustion and terror. Yet her words still carried a strength that defied her years. "Mama said you'd save me," she sobbed. The guard laughed cruelly, shoving her roughly back against the post. But Gideon's hands only clenched tighter on his rifle, his jaw set like stone. The men around the fire had no idea. They had no idea that death itself was crouching in the tree line, its eyes burning, just waiting for the moment to strike. The camp would sleep soon, and when it did, Gideon Holt would descend like the storm the mountains had raised him to be. Night thickened over the valley, the stars hidden behind a low, heavy sweep of cloud. The hunters' campfire flared high, sending sparks dancing up into the dark, their laughter rising with a drunken, arrogant confidence. They thought the girl was broken. They thought Gideon Holt was a fugitive, wounded and fading into the deep timber. They did not know that he crouched among the rocks just above them, every breath measured, every muscle wound tight with a righteous purpose. Clara's sobs still reached him, faint yet sharp as thorns against his heart. She was tied to a post near the center of the camp, her small head bowed, her calico scrap clutched in her bound hands. The guard beside her was leaning heavy against the post now, the bottle nearly empty, his rifle propped lazily within reach. The rest of the men were sprawled near the fire, tossing dice, arguing over coin, their voices rough with drink. In the far corner of the camp, chains clattered as the other captives shifted in their pen, silent but restless with a desperate, unspoken hope. Gideon's jaw was locked. He could not leave them. He could not save only one when the Lord had placed so many broken souls in his path. Yet to charge in blindly would be suicide. He needed more than courage. He needed wisdom. He slid back deeper into the shadows, scanning the camp's perimeter, when his eyes caught a flicker of movement. It was familiar, steady, Abraham Cutter. The older man emerged from the tree line on the far side of the clearing, crouched low, his rifle cradled in his calloused hands. His beard was frosted with sweat and snow, his eyes were hard, but they were alive. A surge of powerful relief washed through Gideon's chest. Abraham had survived. They met in silence, crouching together behind a massive fallen log. Abraham's hand gripped Gideon's forearm, a wordless bond of brotherhood reforged in the darkness. Gideon whispered, his voice barely more than the rush of the wind. They have her, and more. Abraham's eyes followed his pointing finger, falling on the chained pen. His face darkened. The devil's work, he muttered. Then he looked back at Gideon. What's the plan? Gideon's gaze returned to Clara. The child's small frame trembled in the firelight, her lips moving silently. Praying, perhaps, still believing. Her mother's words were still guiding her, even here in the pit of her enemies. Gideon drew in a steadying breath. We break the pen, free them all, use the chaos to get to Clara. Abraham's brow furrowed. 2 men against 20, Gideon. Gideon's voice was iron. The Lord doesn't count numbers, Abraham. He counts faith. Abraham held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. Then let's be his hands tonight. They moved with the patience of wolves. Abraham circled wide, slipping down toward the far side of the camp, while Gideon edged closer and closer to the captive's pen. The people inside stirred when they saw him, their eyes widening with a sudden, dangerous hope. He pressed a single finger to his lips, urging silence. Their chains clattered faintly as they shifted closer to the gate. Desperation and fear etched into their faces. Gideon's heart burned hotter. No one deserved to die in iron. He reached the pen, crouching low in the deep shadow. The lock on the gate was thick, forged iron meant to withstand brute force. Gideon slipped his knife from his belt, wedging the tip against the hasp. He strained, his muscles tight, but the hard metal held fast. It wouldn't break. Then a hand brushed his arm from inside the pen. He looked up to find a woman, her face hollow with hunger, but her eyes fierce and unbroken. She pressed a thin, bent scrap of wire into his palm, her lips mouthing a single word. Use it. Gideon's chest tightened with gratitude. He took the wire and worked it into the lock, his fingers surprisingly steady, despite the roar of blood in his ears. Seconds stretched out, feeling like hours. The sounds of dice and drunken laughter filled the camp. At last, with a soft, almost imperceptible click, the lock gave way. The heavy chain slackened. The captives froze, waiting. Gideon lifted a single finger. Not yet. Across the fire, Abraham moved into position. Gideon saw the flash of his hand, a quick signal they had shared in wars long past. On Gideon's answering nod, Abraham fired. His rifle thundered. The guard by Clara collapsed before he could even lift his own weapon. Shouts erupted. Men scrambled for their guns, their dice scattering into the dirt. In that exact moment, Gideon kicked the gate wide open, his voice a low, powerful growl. Run when I say run! Chaos tore through the camp. The hunters dashed for their rifles, some firing wild shots into the dark. Abraham's rifle cracked in a steady, punishing rhythm, each shot felling a man before he could find his bearings. Gideon darted from the pen, cutting Clara's ropes with one swift stroke of his knife. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing, her fingers clutching at his coat. I knew you'd come, she cried against his chest. You're safe now, Gideon said, his eyes never leaving the storm of battle erupting around them. A bullet hissed past his ear, slamming hard into the post. He swung Clara onto his back, her arms locking tight around his neck. Hold on, Clara. Don't let go. He turned back to the pen, shouting at the top of his lungs. Now! Run! The captives surged forward, chains rattling as they stumbled out into freedom. Some of them grabbed weapons from the fallen hunters, their terror turning instantly into a righteous fury. The camp dissolved into a whirlwind of chaos. Shouts, gunfire, the clash of steel. Gideon fought his way through it all, his rifle booming, every shot driving a path for the desperate souls fleeing the pit. Clara clung to him, her sobs drowned out by the roar of the battle. Abraham fought like a man reborn, his voice ringing out above the din. Keep moving, don't stop. Together they carved a path through firelight and blood, dragging the broken and the weak toward the safety of the timber. But the leader, the man with the smirk, had not yet shown himself. Gideon felt it before he saw it, the weight of unseen eyes in the dark, the venomous presence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then the voice came, smooth and cruel, cutting through the chaos like a razor. You've made a terrible mistake, Holt. She was ours. The leader stepped from the shadows of a large tent, a rifle in his hand, his smirk as cold as the steel glinting in the firelight. And behind him, fresh riders poured into the camp, their dark silhouettes blotting out the flames. Gideon's stomach dropped. The hunters were more than he had counted, more than he had dared to believe. Clara whimpered, her arms tightening around his neck. Don't let them take me back. Gideon's heart hardened. He shifted her higher on his back, his voice low but unshakable. They won't. Not while I stand. The leader raised his rifle, his cold eyes narrowing. Then you'll fall tonight. The battlefield suddenly stilled. For a moment, all Gideon could hear was Clara's ragged breathing, the crackle of the fire, and the sound of chains still dragging on the frozen ground. Then the storm broke anew. The firelight painted the snow crimson as the camp erupted into a final, desperate storm of violence and fear. Gideon tightened his grip on Clara, her small arms wound around his neck as though she were clinging to life itself, which in truth she was. Abraham Cutter stood at his side, his rifle braced, his eyes burning with the kind of faith that only comes from knowing that death might be the price of doing what is right. Across the fire, the leader of the hunters raised his own rifle, his cruel smirk twisting in the orange glow. The first shot cracked, a bullet tearing through the air. Gideon twisted, dropping behind an overturned supply crate as the shot split the log just behind him, sending splinters flying. Abraham fired back instantly, his shot true. One of the fresh riders fell from his saddle, crashing hard into the dirt. Shouts rang out, torches waved. The camp was alive with chaos. The freed captives scattered, some running for the deep timber, others scrambling for any weapon they could find to fight back. Chains clattered against the ground as the last bonds fell away. Gideon pressed Clara tight against his back, whispering into her tangled hair. Close your eyes. Don't let go of me. She obeyed instantly, her little fingers digging into his coat, her body trembling but unbroken. Gideon rose, his rifle braced against his shoulder, and fired into the oncoming wave of men. Each shot was measured, steady. This was not wild fury. This was deliberate, righteous wrath. Men fell, torches dropped, but more pressed forward. The leader advanced with a cruel confidence, shouting above the din, You think you can save her, Holt? You think you can save them all? This land doesn't belong to men like you. It belongs to power. It belongs to us. Gideon's jaw clenched. He fired again, forcing the man to duck behind a wagon, then turned to Abraham. We have to break them here. If we let them scatter, they'll hunt us to the end of the earth. Abraham nodded grimly. Then here we stand. The two men fought back to back, their rifles booming, every shot echoing through the valley. Abraham's voice rose above the chaos, deep and powerful, like a preacher's cry. Stand fast! Freedom is worth the blood. His words rallied the captives. Many of them turned from flight to fight, their desperation burning into a hot defiance. Women who had been chained just hours before now seized rifles from fallen men, firing with trembling hands but fierce hearts. A boy, barely older than Clara, swung a discarded axe, his eyes blazing with the first raw taste of freedom. The camp had become a true battlefield. Smoke curled thick. Torches hissed as they were dropped into the snow. Horses screamed and reared, some bolting into the night, their riders crushed beneath their panicked hooves. Gideon moved through it all like a force of nature, his rifle booming, his knife flashing whenever the hunters came too close. Clara clung to him still, her weight a living anchor, a constant reminder of the promise he had made. At last, the leader rose from behind the wagon, his rifle aimed squarely at Gideon's chest. "It ends now!" he snarled. His shot rang out. Gideon twisted, but the bullet still found him, grazing his shoulder, a hot fire searing through flesh. He staggered but did not fall. Clara's cry pierced the night, her tiny voice breaking. "Don't leave me!" Her words struck him deeper than the bullet ever could. Gideon surged forward with a roar, barreling straight into the leader before the man could reload. The two men crashed into the snow, rolling in a desperate blur of fists and steel. The leader was younger, quicker, but Gideon was forged of the mountain itself. Every blow he landed carried the weight of his grief, of his years of silence, of a promise made to a dying mother. A knife came free. The leader's smirk faltered as Gideon drove the blade aside and pinned him hard to the frozen ground. "You will chain no more soul," Gideon growled, his voice as low and final as thunder. With one last powerful surge, he ended it. The leader's body stilled, his eyes wide with shock, his smirk finally gone forever. A heavy silence fell over the camp, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ragged, desperate breaths of the survivors. The hunters who remained alive fled into the trees, their courage scattered with their leader's blood in the snow. Abraham lowered his rifle, his chest heaving, his eyes searching the smoke-filled clearing. "It's done," he said hoarsely. Gideon staggered back to his feet, lifting Clara from his back and into his arms once more. Her tears streaked his coat, but her eyes shone with a fierce, unwavering relief. "You came," she whispered, her voice trembling, but sure. "Mama said you'd save me, and you did." Gideon pressed his forehead against hers, his own tears finally falling freely, mixing with the soot and blood on his face. "By God's strength, not mine," he murmured. "But yes, Clara, you're safe now." The freed captives gathered around them, their faces weary but alive. Some wept openly, clutching one another. Others simply stared at the broken chains on the ground, scarcely believing they were truly gone. Abraham laid a heavy hand on Gideon's wounded shoulder, his eyes filled with a solemn pride. "We've done more than save a child tonight, old friend. We've struck a blow against evil itself." Gideon looked at Clara, at her small hands still clutching the scrap of calico. He thought of her mother, of the faith that had carried this child through chains and fire. He thought of his own losses, the graves he had left behind on this same mountain. And he knew then that solitude was no longer his path. The Lord had broken his chains too, the chains of grief and guilt. He had broken them by giving him this child to protect. Clara laid her head against his shoulder, whispering one last time, as soft as a prayer, "Mama said you'd save me." And Gideon, the mountain man who had once lived only for silence, wept openly as he whispered back, "And I will. All the days I draw breath, Clara, I will." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and smoke away into the vast wilderness. The storm had passed. The chains lay broken in the snow. And for the first time in years, Gideon Holt walked forward not as a man bound by his grief, but as a protector, a father, and a servant of a purpose far greater than his own solitude. What do you think will become of Gideon and Clara? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of a promise kept and justice delivered, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the map.